A half of correspondents who employed Chinese news assistants had their assistants harassed or interfered with, and 18% had visa problems. And about half of those who had visa problems reported that those problems were due to their coverage. So we're seeing the visa being used as a mechanism to try and control coverage, to try and control content.
Well, do you think there's a connection between what's happening with lawyers, dissidents, Western journalists, Chinese journalists, educators, internet activists? Is there a pattern here?
I don't think there's any question that there's a connection. All of those categories you listed are critical voices, and I think that there's an ongoing and maybe escalating campaign to silence critical voices.
What's been very clear has been this kind of chipping away and closure of space that we had actually seen open, even within China's already closed and controlled political system. So for example, as part of this report, it's called the Politburo's Predicament, and basically what we were doing was we were looking at the evolution of the security and censorship apparatus under Xi Jinping. And some of its implications. So as part of that, we identified 17 different groups of individuals or potential targets of repression. You see this consistent kind of closing of space that existed before. And that's very disheartening for people working in civil society, people who are working within an already difficult environment. A lot of the people being targeted are also individuals who, a lot of times it's critical voices, but they aren't necessarily people being overtly engaging in overt political advocacy or calling for an end of one-party rule or engaging in activities that the Communist Party clearly considers sensitive. A lot of these people who are being targeted now are people who had previously been on the safe side of the Communist Party's red lines. People who had been very deliberately, sometimes very carefully, walking the line to try to stay, in some cases even self-censoring or being selective about what they might speak about or do, or just trying to work on issues and areas that seem to be tolerated by the Communist Party.
So Sarah, are we talking about people going to jail or people simply being silenced?
No, I think one of the features of it is people actually going to jail. That's one of the changes in the methods. We're talking about people not just being harassed or intimidated, but people actually being imprisoned, people being detained. In some cases, it might be people who are working on sensitive areas, like the journalist Gao Yu, or a couple of Falun Gong practitioners whose daughter called me last week, and they had been in prison previously, but had been out and been safe for a decade. And same thing with Gao Yu. She'd been working for a long time. She'd been in prison after 1989. But she was somebody who was somehow flying under the radar. Her activities were known and were tolerated, and all of a sudden, she was just sentenced to 7 years in prison. So, I think, two other quick points, and then I don't want to take up too much time. So I think that's definitely been a feature of what's been happening under Xi Jinping. Ironically, some of it is driven by insecurity, I think, and a situation where actually the regime was facing something of a legitimacy crisis, because you actually often find that authoritarian regimes that are more confident and say maybe they are a bit more tolerant of critical voices, of more public debate, but it's actually when they're feeling very insecure that they feel the need to control more tightly, and that was evident in some of the internal speeches and documents and censorship directives that we analyzed for the report. I think the last thing I would say in terms of some of the implications, and I think we'll be talking more about that later, is I think the concern is that this can really backfire. That what happens is that you then have people who have been trying to work through the system, and even those people who have been trying to work with the Communist Party or trying to advocate, for change, gradual change, under the current system, are finding that even their voices their activities are being suppressed, that they're facing grave danger, and I think that pushes people to take a more active role, and even in the expansion of internet censorship creates a situation where there are more people in China encountering it, and creates and generates more resentment towards the Communist Party. So I think even in a situation where we're seeing a very clear chilling effect from this crackdown, and maybe publicly people aren't willing to speak up as much, some of the research that we've done, I think research other people have done, point to kind of growing quiet resentment happening under the surface, and that becomes a much less stable situation in terms of when and how that may pop out.
I think Xi is really wanted to restore the party's credibility, right? That's the core. This is about restore the party's CCP's credibility and to also reinforce or reassure the one party rule, right? And to this end, this anti-graft campaign, must continue, right? It's no longer okay, so you can't say this, you can't say that, but there will be ramifications if you do this, if you say that, right? And you will be put into jail, right? And your voices will be muted. And also you have to think about his legacy, right? And he actually essentially grew up during the PRC era, right? He's 60 years old. We're talking about PRC is reaching its 65 years old, right? So he's the same generation there. And so that's the kind of education he receives. And he's loyal to his own political heritage.
But today what we have is a gradual accretion, now getting to significant proportions, of lots of public interest lawyers, not merely human rights lawyers who have been long putting their tails on the line, you could say, but public interest lawyers who thought they were on the right side of the line no longer find they are. And we're getting more and more of these people, and the question is what to do about them. I can't disagree with a word that has been said by our colleagues or you characterizing how depressing the last 3 years have become. Of course, it was bad before that. Ai Weiwei case, Gao Sheng, these all occurred before Xi Jinping, but the intensity has increased, and the number of people now who don't go to jail because they've been out of the country or managed to escape, but they have managed to come here, is increasing. And the question is what to do about it. Mark Twain in that famous statement said, everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. And my task today is to try to mobilize the masses, as it were. Raise your consciousness, because every day I hear from people who really need help. And it isn't only the plight of the refugee who hasn't got a job, has a family, hasn't got the means of support, but it's people who have seen their organizations attacked in the mainland and are seeking ways of not only finding something useful for themselves to do during the period they can't go back, but are trying to figure out what can they do that can keep their organizations alive, if only in a fragmentary way. And they have lots of problems. The first is financial, of course, but beyond that, it's finding colleagues and affiliation, a base. They've lost their organizations in the mainland. They need moral support as well as financial. They have visa problems. Many of them aren't allowed to work here at this point. And they need help in figuring out how can you turn a vice into a virtue. I was discussing with my colleague Chun Yujia before how best to say that. Chinese share that sentiment with us. Huai shi yinggai bianzheng hao shi. Or as she taught me just recently, zhuan huo wu fu. And the question really is, can we turn something that's a tragic situation and an immediate and urgent situation into a benefit that will educate more of us about what's going on in China, that will help these organizations endure if they can and reach the Chinese people to the extent we can do that. And it's an enormous challenge, but I think we have to do it. I'm particularly aware of this because when I was 8 or 9 years old, Jewish refugees who were my relatives came over from Hitler, and they were stranded. And what could they do? And I remember as a kid being impressed or depressed by the situation. Well, now we have
You would compare this, you would put this on the same par, this would be, you'd compare this with what happened back then?
Well, the numbers are not yet as great, but if we look at our respective professions, whether it be journalism or law or other subjects, they're growing. And the legal people, the public interest lawyers, the human rights lawyers, this is a new situation, and we ought to be doing something to try to help them. The judges in China are beset by all kinds of distorting influences. Corruption is the most obvious, party control is another one, local protection was another one, guanxi is the worst illness Everybody's got a relative or a family friend or somebody who needs help. Everybody calls these judges up. The people who are members of the local people's Congress, the officials, the party people, sometimes just for their own meretricious interests because they can make money out of it or because they want to bail somebody out who's done something awful. Chinese courts have been a mess, and the central government wants to instill more discipline, wants to make them more independent of these adverse, distorting influences, but not to make them independent, but to make them, as you say, more responsive to the central will. It's we would say a federalism problem in a way. China doesn't have a federal system, but a national unitary system. But still, you have a huge population that's very dispersed, and the center has always had trouble keeping control. One of Zhou Yongkang's early reforms, quietly done while he was the head of the Ministry of Public Security, was to take a string of quiet measures to try to get control of the local police. But at the central level, as Wang Qishan, who's about to come here and try to get some of their criminals, fugitives who fled China back to China, he's made it very clear, as every leader does, at the central level, the party controls the courts. There is no illusion of independence. And yet they have to deal with all kinds of ordinary cases as well as sensitive cases, and how they do it is a huge challenge. So when they say they're for judicial independence, it's meant in a very technical, local sense. If the party ideology is not sufficient, as it plainly isn't, they're now looking again to national, historical, cultural resources. And the only good point of that I can see is for years I've been trying to interest Chinese law students in China as well as out to do something to learn more about their own legal tradition. And who now is giving them the stimulus? Xi Jinping. He's talking about the Confucianists, and occasionally he talks about the legalists, the Fajia. I think he realizes now he's making a mistake because that's too close for comfort, since they were highly dictatorial and they used law as an instrument of repression. And I could see where he may feel some sentimental links to them, but it's probably not good propaganda. But the fact is, it's not only ideological, of course. You have literally millions of people in China, but still a small minority compared to the dominant group, who are unhappy with what's happening. They know their illegal reforms have had a setback, but they're trying within the limits of the possible to improve a little bit of legislation there, to try to improve rules of practice here. They're making some progress. Pieces of paper are intermittently getting better. The problem is, to what extent are they being implemented and followed? And this is a daily struggle. And it's not a simple one, but these people deserve our help and support to the extent we can still communicate it. But that's part of Xi's drive. He wants to limit our capacity to support these people. He's more aware than we of all the daily disruptions in China, the protests, some of them violent. He lives under the specter of what happened to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and he has been quoted as saying, Gorbachev was not a man enough to stand up to the challenge. And I think he believes, to this extent, what Mao said, a single spark can start a prairie fire. And he's not going to allow any spark. And we ought to consider also religion, the expanding repression of religion. All forms of expression now are going to be under greater pressure. But we can't be sure he's going to continue to succeed, and he can't either. He's a high roller, he's a gambler. The anti-corruption campaign keeps reaching more and more influential people, and he's obviously cautious. Look at the way he's handling the Zhou Yongkang case. They're having a lot of trouble figuring out how to deal with that and with all its consequences. It could be that in 2 more years he will have inspired enough reaction that he might not get a second term. It's not necessarily inevitable.